I'm St John Flynn. Thanks for joining us here on The Front Row. On this Labor Day 2008, we're looking back at some of the noteworthy projects and memorable moments in the working life of clarinetist and saxophone player Richard Nunnemaker, who retired exactly a month ago after 41 years as a member of the Houston Symphony. In the second part of his conversation with KUHF's Bob Stevenson, Mr. Nunnemaker talks about his lifelong affinity for new music and about the contemporary works he had the opportunity to perform and record during the 1980s and 90s under Houston Symphony music directors Sergio Commissiona and Christoph Eschenbach.
Sergio Commissiona was the music director of the Houston Symphony during the decade of the 80s. Tell us about your time with him.
Commissiona was a very interesting conductor and a very interesting music director. I mean, his tenure, there was a lot of turbulence at that time with the orchestra and with the economy and so forth. But actually, Commissiona was probably the first music director that really set this orchestra in motion for those Eschenbach years, for it to become a really great orchestra. And one of the things that sticks in my mind mostly is there was no more faking at rehearsals. Up until that time, we'd have 4 or 5 rehearsals for a concert. And most of us would just learn the music during the rehearsal. We just came in the first rehearsal and figured out what we needed to practice and work on and learn it that way. And when Commissiona came in, I think it was his second or third week here, his title was Houston's music director. That he started, one of the rehearsals, he would stop just in the middle of a piece and he would look back and say, "Bass clarinet, let me hear your part there."
Oh.
Oops. This was the first rehearsal. Second flute, let me hear your part. So it was like working with Miles Davis. If Miles called a tune you didn't know, that meant you had 24 hours to learn the tune. And with Commissiona, it was very clear. Oops, okay, from now on, first rehearsal, better have this part down. And actually, it made a big difference. I mean, then we could spend the rehearsals actually working on the musical stuff and making music. But also with Commissiona, he was the first music director and the only music director we had that actually had a composer in residence. He brought in Tobias Picker, who was here for 2 years as a composer in residence.
Oh, that was during, okay,
yeah.
Because Mr. Picker still had a relationship with the orchestra when Eschenbach came, but this actually started under Commissiona.
It started under Commissiona.
Okay. And you recorded, what was it, the Second Symphony of Tobias Picker,
Tobias Picker
while he was composer in residence
yes.
under Commissiona.
Right. Mm-hmm. But the other things with Commissiona that really stick in my mind was his Schoenberg Girl Eater. And along with the Schoenberg Girl Eater, the Bartók Bluebeard's Castle was also marvelous.
Now,
and
did you do that with Houston Grand Opera, or was that a Houston Symphony concert?
It was a stage concert version of Bluebeard's.
That's an amazing piece.
It's a wonderful piece.
It's interesting to me that most of these most noteworthy pieces that you've cited as you recall each of the eras and each of the conductors with the orchestra have been some of the most complex and tending toward the modern and really interesting pieces, from the Berg operas to the Stravinsky Rite of Spring to the Bartók and the Schoenberg here. Those are the ones that
that's my thing.
Stuck with you, yes.
That's my thing. Modern music.
Okay.
Yeah.
Reflecting your own tastes and predilections. Right. The orchestra comes into the modern age and reaches a new level of professionalism
Right.
itself. And that, as you said, paved the way for the Eschenbach years,
Yeah.
the 90s.
The 90s. Those were exciting years. Christoph came in. I guess we first saw him doing, what was it? He came in, we were supposed to do Bruckner 7, I believe, in Carnegie Hall. In Commissiona, that was the last tour that Sergei did with us, and he had a heart attack.
Oh, that's right.
And we brought in Christoph, came in the last minute. He had just a quick run-through rehearsal at Carnegie Hall, and we did the performance.
Quick run-through rehearsal of a Bruckner symphony?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
And, we had like a 1-hour rehearsal and did the performance that night. It was spectacular. And that sort of sealed the deal.
So, stepping into the spotlight to save the day, Christoph Eschenbach led the orchestra into a whole new era.
It was those were really exciting years. Some of the stuff that we did with Christoph, the way he built the orchestra. When Christoph was through with this orchestra, it was like a well-oiled machine. It was the quickest orchestra I'd ever played with. He could just flick that stick and the orchestra was there. It was just razor sharp.
He had a way of almost milking the emotion out of a piece, and his tempos tended to be fairly slow. Some of his high romantic pieces could go on forever, but they were so wonderful and so beautiful that you didn't care. It could last forever, and you would have been there until the very end because they were just so gorgeously performed.
Well, I think that was his secret, though. He really believed and was committed to what he was doing at the time, and he would just project that to the orchestra. None of us will ever forget the opening of Parsifal, that Robert Wilson production with HGO.
Oh, yes.
I mean, the opening it seemed like it took 2 hours. it was the slowest,
just
the opening.
Right.
It was the slowest Parsifal I think anyone ever played, but it was spectacular. It was breathtaking. Every performance was just breathtaking.
Well, now you've made a reference to this, what was at the time still ongoing relationship between the orchestra and Houston Grand Opera, and he kind of brought that collaboration to a new level also.
Oh, well, let's see. We did Mozart, Magic Flute, Don Giovanni, and Parsifal, and Tristan, and then Rosenkavalier, Salome, and Electra. Spectacular. Tristan, I think was the last opera we did with Christoph and HGO.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us felt that that's when the orchestra really came into its own at that time. The wind section, it's just one of the great experiences I've had in my musical career was playing with that particular wind section.
A very interesting recording that the symphony made during that time, and one that kind of surprised me when it came out was what I believe was the first recording of the violin concertos by the minimalist composers John Adams and Philip Glass.
Yes, we recorded those with Robert McDuffie, and I believe those sessions went for 2 days, and we had 2 sessions each day to get those down, and they were wonderful performances. We also took the Adams on a European tour with McDuffie.
Interesting that the orchestra pioneered those 2 particular works. I don't recall that he had sort of exhibited much relationship with the minimalist school of modern composition before that.
Well, he and I used to have conversations about minimalist composers. I had just recorded Steve Reich's New York Counterpoint for one of my CDs, and I'd given Christoph a copy and asked him, if he would listen to it, and he was very complimentary, but I think his comment to me was, "But I do not like minimalistic composers too well. I'm not too interested then." I think it was the following year, a year and a half later, we did the Atoms in the Glass, and he had a wonderful understanding of how those pieces worked and how they were supposed to be put together.
Well, maybe you were part of his conversion process there.
He's a very interesting man in that regard, and when we probably did more commissioning and more new music under Christoph than we did under any other music director during my tenure.
It's true.
And some really unusual composers. He took a real liking to Christopher Rouse. And one of the really great recordings we did was Rouse's Phaeton Overture and the Second Symphony. They're absolutely wonderful recordings. The orchestra just sounds marvelous on those recordings.
If there was any doubt about Mr. Eschenbach's commitment to the orchestra, you've got a little story that he would be around even when he wasn't conducting that week.
Well, the interesting thing, Christoph was like the Phantom of the Opera. If he had a week off and he wasn't performing someplace, he would make a beeline. I don't think he ever slept. But he'd make a beeline to Houston, and we could be rehearsing a Pops concert, opera, or with a guest conductor. And he would just show up backstage. You'd see him at the first rehearsal, the second rehearsal. He'd be at the performances. He was there listening to his orchestra, making mental notes and so forth. And if he heard something he liked from an individual player or didn't like, he would call the person in, and he would be very complimentary, but, make an observation. I really like this a whole lot, or maybe you could do this, maybe you could do that. And then when he would come back to rehearse the orchestra for one of his concerts, he might talk about what he had heard the week before or 2 weeks before and say, maybe we need to do this and do that. And a lot of times he would just make changes with maybe just the way we were seating on stage, or just in general balancing sounds and so forth.
Richard Nunemaker speaking about Maestro Christoph Eschenbach, who was music director of the Houston Symphony for 11 years through the decade of the 90s. For his part, Mr. Nunemaker was the orchestra's bass clarinetist and saxophone player for 41 years, from the time he was hired by André Previn at the beginning of the 1967-68 season until he retired just a month ago at the end of July. This special Labor Day edition of our programme is a retrospective of Richard Nunemaker's 4-decade-long career with the symphony. In the final portion of his conversation with KUHF's Bob Stevenson, he discusses the period, also during the 90s, when the Houston Symphony Pops similarly came into its own, and he recalls the symphony project that meant the most to him as a musician.